Clint Harrison's farm wasn't just a patch of earth, it was his legacy. Nestled amid gently rolling fields and shaded by century-old oaks, the farm had been in his family for generations. Every sunrise found him tending to rows of heirloom tomatoes, crisp lettuce, and vibrant carrots, all grown with organic care and painstaking attention. The vegetables weren't merely produce for sale. They were the embodiment of tradition, pride, and the honest labor that defined his life. Clint, a rugged, self-reliant farmer with hands weathered by years of hard work, had always taken great pride in his sustainable methods. He loved the earthy aroma of freshly tilled soil and the satisfaction that came from nurturing his crops from seed to harvest. His vegetable garden, bordered by wildflowers and rustic wooden fences, was a sanctuary, a place where every plant told a story of perseverance and legacy. But as idyllic as life on the farm had been, a new threat was looming on the horizon. Over the past few months, whispers of overreach from the local homeowners association, HOA, had begun to circulate among the rural community. At the heart of these whispers was one name that seemed to embody entitlement and arrogance: Karen. Karen Miller, the self-appointed HOA president, carried herself with a clipped efficiency that left no room for error. Clad in sharply tailored skirts, polished shoes, and an ever-present clipboard, she patrolled the neighborhood with an air of superiority. To Karen, every property was subject to her exacting standards of order and aesthetics, even a working farm with its natural unmanicured charm. The spark that ignited the feud came on a blistering summer afternoon. Clint had just finished harvesting a bumper crop of fresh vegetables when he noticed a commotion near the perimeter of his field. A group of impeccably dressed women, laughing and chattering, had set up a picnic right among his prized produce. At the center of the gathering stood Karen, directing her friends with the precision of a drill sergeant. Without any invitation or permission, she had commandeered a section of Clint's vegetable garden for her community picnic. Clint's heart sank as he approached the scene. The vibrant greens and reds of his carefully nurtured crops were being trampled underfoot, and baskets of freshly picked vegetables, items he'd planned to sell at the local market, were now scattered among plastic chairs and picnic blankets. "Karen," he called out, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. "What do you think you're doing on my land?" Karen turned, her smile thin and condescending. "Clint, it's a community gathering. The HOA believes in fostering neighborly spirit, and what better place than your farm's natural setting? Besides, these vegetables are simply too good to go to waste. We're sharing them with everyone." "Sharing is fine," Clint replied, his eyes hardening. "But taking what isn't offered is theft. My vegetables are my livelihood, my legacy. You can't just waltz in and help yourself without my consent." A tense silence fell as a few nearby onlookers, neighbors who had heard the commotion, paused in their tracks. Karen's eyes flashed with indignation. "The rules are clear, Mr. Harrison. All properties within the community must contribute to the neighborhood's well-being. Your refusal to abide by these guidelines only proves that you're out of touch with community values." For Clint, this confrontation was more than a clash over a picnic. It was a blatant challenge to his right to manage his own land. His vegetables represented years of tradition, the honest sweat of generations, and now they were being pillaged by entitled rulemakers. "I run my farm the way my family has for decades," he said firmly. "I respect my neighbors, but my property is not a free-for-all for your HOA's whims." Karen's smile faltered as she held up a printed notice adorned with the HOA's insignia. "Consider this your first warning," she declared. "Any further disregard for our community standards will result in fines, and trust me, we're very serious about compliance." As Karen swept away with her entourage, leaving behind a trail of indignation and ruined vegetables, Clint's resolve only deepened. In that moment, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows over his trampled garden, he vowed that he would defend his legacy by any means necessary. The battle lines had been drawn. One side stood for tradition and the freedom to farm as one sees fit, and the other for the oppressive, overreaching dictates of an HOA that cared more about appearances than the people behind the produce. The morning after the unauthorized picnic, Clint awoke to an unsettling discovery. Taped to his weathered farmhouse door was an official-looking envelope bearing the HOA seal. With a sinking heart, he opened it to find a hefty fine of $750, accompanied by a stern warning for unauthorized use of community resources and improper management of communal produce. The legalese was dense and intimidating, a clear message that the HOA, under Karen's watch, intended to make an example of him. Before Clint could even digest the contents, he saw Karen on the edge of his property. Standing with arms crossed and a haughty expression, she greeted him in a clipped tone. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison. I trust you've read our notice? The rules apply to everyone, after all." Her voice dripped with entitlement, as if the fine were nothing more than a routine matter. Clint's jaw tightened. "Karen, I've run this farm for generations. My methods have stood the test of time, and your notice is nothing but an attempt to control what I do on my own land." Unperturbed, Karen merely tilted her head and replied, "We're all part of this community, and your failure to conform jeopardizes our collective image. Compliance is not optional." Later that day, as Clint moved among his fields repairing fence posts and checking on his remaining vegetable rows, a nondescript black van pulled onto his property. Out stepped two inspectors, clipboard in hand, who began a meticulous examination of his garden. They measured the spacing between rows, scrutinized the layout of his vegetable plots, and took photographs of every corner of his once pristine farm. All the while, Karen lingered nearby, observing the proceedings with a smug satisfaction. Clint, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and disbelief, began documenting the intrusion. He snapped photos of the inspectors at work and recorded snippets of their conversations. He knew that every piece of evidence would be crucial when he challenged this overreach. Later that afternoon, after the inspectors departed, he sat at his old wooden desk inside the farmhouse, reviewing his notes and drafting a formal complaint. He cited local agricultural exemptions and historical preservation statutes that protected traditional farming practices, emphasizing that his methods were neither dangerous nor in violation of any reasonable law. Across town, murmurs began to spread. Neighbors who had previously kept quiet about similar grievances started whispering about the arbitrary fines and invasive inspections that had plagued their own properties. At the local feed store, hushed voices discussed how the HOA's actions, always spearheaded by Karen, were more about power and profit than community welfare. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Karen returned to Clint's property. In front of the farmhouse, beneath the glow of a single porch light, she brandished another notice. "You have 48 hours to correct your non-compliance issues, Mr. Harrison," she warned sharply. "Failure to do so will result in further penalties." Clint's response was measured, yet resolute. "I run my farm my way. I'm not going to let your arbitrary rules destroy a legacy that's been built on decades of hard work." His words, quiet but forceful, hung in the cool night air as Karen stormed off, leaving behind a palpable sense of defiance. That night, Clint sat outside on his porch, the fine and the day's events replaying in his mind. He knew that the HOA's first power move was only the beginning, a prelude to a battle for his rights and his livelihood. And though the fine stung, his resolve burned hotter than ever. He would fight back, armed with evidence, tradition, and the unyielding spirit of a true farmer. In the days that followed, the conflict on Clint's farm escalated beyond fines and formal warnings. What had begun as a single act of blatant intrusion soon morphed into a full-scale assault on his property rights. Neighbors, once resigned to Karen's overreach, started sharing whispered stories of similar injustices, of arbitrary fines, sudden inspections, and even threats of legal action. One gray afternoon, while Clint was repairing a section of his weathered fence, his longtime friend and neighbor, Doug, pulled up in his pickup truck. In a hushed tone, Doug confided, "Clint, you're not alone. I've heard Karen's been issuing fines left and right, and there are rumors that some of the money is going into a secret fund for her personal projects." The revelation hit Clint hard. His fight was no longer merely about a stolen picnic or a fine. It was about an entire system designed to subjugate independent farmers and force them into submission. Driven by a mix of righteous anger and determination, Clint began to investigate the inner workings of the HOA. He made discreet trips to the county clerk's office, scoured public records, and even recorded conversations at local community meetings. What he uncovered was disturbing. Irregularities in the HOA's finances, unexplained transfers, and minutes from board meetings that hinted at collusion between Karen and certain board members. Evidence piled up that the HOA was less interested in fostering community spirit and more in exploiting its power for personal gain. Late one stormy night, as lightning flashed over the fields, Clint reviewed his findings in the farmhouse kitchen. He sorted through photocopies of financial ledgers and handwritten notes from anonymous informants. Each new piece of evidence reinforced his conviction that Karen's campaign was corrupt from the core. He compiled his documents into a detailed dossier, a record that would serve as the foundation for his fight back against the oppressive HOA. The tension in the community was palpable. At a clandestine town hall meeting held in the back room of a local diner, disgruntled homeowners voiced their own tales of arbitrary fines and overbearing regulations. One elderly woman tearfully recounted how a minor deviation in her garden layout had cost her dearly, while another man admitted he'd been pressured into making voluntary contributions that mysteriously vanished into the HOA coffers. Clint listened intently, knowing that the collective outrage was building into a force that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, Karen's tactics grew bolder. Not content with fines and inspections, she began threatening more drastic measures. In a series of curt, official letters, she warned that failure to comply with the ever-shifting rules could lead to the seizure of property rights. Rumors spread that the HOA might even pursue legal action to forcibly reclaim sections of the farm, all under the guise of community safety improvements. Every day, as Clint walked among his vegetable rows, now a poignant reminder of what was at stake, his resolve hardened. He installed additional security cameras around the perimeter of his property and kept a meticulous log of every encounter. His phone became a constant companion, recording every conversation with inspectors and noting the time and details of each intrusion. Each documented moment was a strike against the oppressive machinery of the HOA. The battle lines were clear. On one side stood Karen and her enforcers, representatives of an intrusive bureaucracy intent on reshaping the community to fit a narrow, elitist vision. On the other side was Clint, a proud, independent farmer defending not only his property, but the very right to live by long-standing traditions. As the wind howled over the dark fields and thunder rumbled in the distance, Clint realized that this struggle was about much more than vegetables. It was about freedom, dignity, and the survival of a way of life that had been passed down through generations. Determined to expose the corruption, Clint reached out to local journalists. He handed over copies of financial records, photographs of invasive inspections, and recordings of damning conversations. The story began to seep into the local press, painting a picture of a community under siege by an HOA that cared more about appearances than people. And so, under a stormy sky that mirrored the turmoil in his heart, Clint prepared for the next phase of the battle. With evidence in hand and the support of a community that was finally waking up to the truth, he vowed that he would not be silenced. The fight against Karen's tyranny was far from over. It was only just beginning. The conflict reached a boiling point on a sweltering summer morning, when Clint arrived in his vegetable garden only to find it in chaos. Overnight, Karen's enforcers had come in and removed entire sections of his prized produce. The freshly ripened tomatoes, crisp lettuce, and vibrant zucchinis were gone, pilfered to be used for a community event organized by the HOA. In their place, hastily erected signs read, "Community Produce, for the greater good." The audacity of the act was staggering. Clint's anger flared as he surveyed the empty beds where his hard work once flourished. This was not merely a case of petty theft. It was an assault on his very livelihood. His vegetables had always been nurtured with care and respect, passed down as a testament to generations of honest farming. Now, they had been hijacked by a bureaucratic mob with no regard for tradition. Determined to reclaim his rights and expose the corruption, Clint gathered his evidence and headed to the next scheduled HOA meeting. The room was filled with anxious homeowners and board members, their faces a mixture of fear and frustration. Taking the stage, Clint laid out a detailed account of the theft, presenting photographic evidence of the cleared fields, copies of the removal orders, and even recorded conversations with inspectors who admitted that the actions were beyond the call of duty. "This is not about maintaining community standards. It's about violating my rights and desecrating a legacy," Clint declared, his voice echoing off the walls of the meeting hall. "My vegetables represent decades of tradition, and no group of self-appointed enforcers has the authority to simply take them for their own use." The room fell into a heavy silence as board members exchanged uneasy glances. Some of the homeowners, emboldened by Clint's words, began to murmur their support. Karen, however, stood at the back with a steely glare, refusing to yield even as evidence mounted against her. As the meeting progressed, more details emerged about the HOA's overreach. It became clear that Karen's actions were part of a broader strategy to consolidate power by controlling every aspect of community life, even the natural bounty of the land. With every new revelation, the assembled crowd's discontent grew. The once feared enforcer of arbitrary rules was now being openly challenged by the very community she had sought to dominate. Emboldened by the support of his neighbors, Clint outlined his plan for a counterattack. "I'm not just here to demand that my vegetables be returned," he said firmly. "I'm here to show that when you try to steal our heritage, you'll get more than you bargained for." A murmur of approval rippled through the audience, and even a few skeptical board members couldn't help but nod in agreement. That very evening, with the seeds of rebellion firmly planted in the community's heart, Clint returned to his farm. He knew that if Karen's tyranny was to be met with real resistance, he had to strike back in a way that would be unforgettable. As he walked through his fields, a mischievous idea took root in his mind, one that would combine the fiery spirit of his traditions with a modern twist of vengeance. He recalled the ghost pepper seeds he'd acquired months earlier, a variety so potent that even a single bite could set one's mouth ablaze. In a secret, deliberate act of rebellion, Clint decided to plant these ghost peppers among his regular vegetable crops. Hidden among the familiar rows of tomatoes and lettuce, the fiery peppers would grow in silence until the moment was right to unleash their full, scorching power. Clint carefully mixed the ghost pepper seeds into the soil of a section of his garden that had been targeted by the HOA. He envisioned the day when Karen, in one of her next overreaching moves, might sample the community produce she'd so arrogantly appropriated, only to find herself facing an unexpected, searing surprise. That night, under a cloak of darkness, Clint documented his secret planting with a quiet satisfaction. He recorded every step, the careful sowing of the tiny lethal seeds, the whisper of the wind through the corn, and the determined glint in his eye. It was an act of both defiance and poetic justice, a promise that Karen's invasive tactics would be met with consequences as intense as the heat of those ghost peppers. As the days turned to weeks, the ghost pepper plants began to flourish alongside Clint's other vegetables, hidden in plain sight. The anticipation built steadily. Neighbors started noticing an unusual kick in some of the produce distributed at community events, though no one could quite place the source of the fiery taste. Meanwhile, Clint maintained his quiet vigilance, knowing that his ultimate counterstrike was nearing fruition. In the midst of this, Karen continued her aggressive campaigns, issuing even more fines and ramping up her inspections. But the seed of rebellion had been firmly planted, both in the hearts of the community and in the very soil of Clint's farm. The battle had shifted from one of overt power plays to a cunning game of nature versus bureaucracy. And Clint was ready to let the heat of those ghost peppers do the talking. Desperation has a way of turning even the most calculating individuals into reckless opportunists. As the community support for Clint swelled and the mounting evidence of corruption against the HOA became impossible to ignore, Karen launched what she believed would be her final, decisive strike. Late one evening, she organized a surprise raid on Clint's farm under the guise of an emergency inspection. In a flurry of stern orders and hastily printed violation notices, she and her entourage descended upon the property. Karen's voice rang out, demanding immediate compliance. "Mr. Harrison, You are in violation of several new community regulations. You must allow us full access to your property for immediate corrective measures." Her tone brooked no argument. The officers, summoned by her urgent call, arrived and began to trample over Clint's carefully cultivated rows, inspecting every inch of his vegetable garden with a severity that bordered on intimidation. Clint, who had long anticipated such a move, calmly confronted the intruders. "This isn't an emergency. It's a power play," he said. He presented his meticulously documented evidence of previous violations and irregularities, his voice unwavering despite the chaos around him. Yet Karen would not be deterred. In a final, desperate bid to assert her dominance, she unveiled a new tactic. She publicly declared that any noncompliance on Clint's part would result in immediate forfeiture of his property rights. The threat was clear and chilling, a warning that if Clint did not surrender to the HOA's demands, he would lose everything he built. As the inspectors milled around, Karen excused herself momentarily, leaving Clint to tend to the uprooted plants and scattered produce. It was during this brief moment of solitude that Clint's secret weapon, his ghost pepper countermeasure, began to show its promise. Earlier that season, he had planted the fiery peppers deep within his vegetable beds, and now those plants had matured, their glossy, red pods nearly indistinguishable from the other crops at first glance. The following day, at a hastily convened community meeting intended to demonstrate the HOA's authority, Karen arrived with an air of forced confidence. The meeting hall was packed with uneasy homeowners, many of whom had suffered under Karen's arbitrary fines and intrusive inspections. Determined to rally the crowd behind her, Karen began to berate Clint for his noncompliance and warned that the HOA would soon enforce severe penalties. But as the meeting unfolded, fate intervened. A volunteer from the community, assigned to distribute a salad prepared from the community produce, which, unknown to Karen, included Clint's ghost pepper, infused vegetables, stepped forward. When Karen, attempting to prove her point by sampling the produce herself, took a bite of a supposedly mild salad, her face contorted in shock. Within seconds, she was overwhelmed by a fiery heat that left her gasping and red-faced before the entire assembly. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room as Karen frantically reached for water and tissue. The unintended spectacle was both hilarious and symbolic. Here was the very enforcer of oppressive rules, suffering the consequences of a retaliation she had never seen coming. Clint, calm and collected, let the moment speak for itself. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the heat is exactly what you deserve." As Karen's desperate move backfired spectacularly, the community support for Clint reached a fever pitch. Neighbors and board members alike began to question not only the legality of Karen's actions, but her entire approach to governance. The evidence was overwhelming. From the ghost pepper incident to the documented abuses of power, every piece of the puzzle painted a picture of a tyrant out of touch with the people she was meant to serve. In the aftermath of that humiliating event, Karen attempted one final gambit. She threatened to call in the police once more, accusing Clint of endangering public health with spiked produce. But the video of her own fiery ordeal had already gone viral among the community, and her credibility was in tatters. The very act she had orchestrated to assert control had instead exposed her vulnerabilities for all to see. By the close of the meeting, it was clear that Karen's days of unchecked authority were numbered. Her final, desperate move had only hastened the collapse of the oppressive regime, and Clint's quiet vengeance, delivered in the form of ghost peppers, became the rallying cry for a community determined to reclaim its rights. In the wake of the disastrous community meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. What had once been a climate of fear and deference was now charged with defiance and hope. Homeowners, emboldened by Clint's stand and the unforgettable ghost pepper incident, began organizing protests and demanding accountability. The evidence of corruption and abuse of power within the HOA had become too overwhelming to ignore. At a specially convened town hall meeting, long-suffering residents took to the stage to recount years of arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and the humiliation inflicted by Karen's reign. Their testimonies, filled with raw emotion and unbridled anger, resonated deeply with everyone present. as more and more community members voiced their support for Clint. Even previously silent board members began questioning the legitimacy of Karen's authority. In a dramatic vote that was broadcast live and witnessed by a record turnout, the HOA board unanimously voted to remove Karen from her position as president. The decision was met with roaring applause and tears of relief from the crowd. For many, it symbolized the end of an era of oppression and the beginning of a new chapter defined by fairness and transparency. As the board moved swiftly to implement reforms, local authorities stepped in as well. The county launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's practices, uncovering a tangled web of misappropriated funds, forged documents, and unauthorized fines. Headlines in the local newspapers screamed of HOA tyranny dismantled and community triumph over corruption, galvanizing public opinion even further. For Clint, the victory was bittersweet. His fields had been scarred by the conflict, and the loss of his vegetables had been a painful blow. Yet, as he surveyed the rebuilding efforts on his farm, a sense of vindication filled his heart. His courageous stand, bolstered by the community's support, had not only reclaimed his land, but had also paved the way for a more just system. Within days of the board's decision, Karen's personal life began to unravel. Public scrutiny mounted as evidence of her misdeeds was laid bare in court, and her lavish lifestyle, once funded by the arbitrary fines she imposed, was exposed for what it was, a sham built on exploitation. Neighbors learned that her bank accounts had been frozen and that her assets were being seized to satisfy mounting legal penalties. In a matter of weeks, Karen's once formidable persona crumbled, and her home was listed for sale amid scandal and public outrage. Community events resumed with a newfound spirit of unity. The new democratically elected community council promised to protect individual property rights and uphold transparency. Clint's farm, once the battleground of a bitter conflict, became a symbol of resilience and renewal, a living testament to the power of community action against tyranny. In quiet moments on his porch, as he sipped his coffee and surveyed the slowly healing fields, Clint allowed himself a small smile. The seeds of resistance he had sown, both metaphorically and quite literally in the form of ghost peppers, had blossomed into a movement that reclaimed dignity and restored hope to the neighborhood. As the public outcry against the HOA reached its crescendo, legal authorities moved swiftly to dismantle the corrupt structure that had long terrorized the community. The county, armed with Clint's comprehensive dossier and a wealth of eyewitness testimony, imposed severe fines on the discredited HOA for violating numerous municipal codes and misusing funds. The investigation laid bare a labyrinth of financial irregularities, including forged documents and unexplained transfers that had enriched a handful of board members at the expense of hardworking residents. Class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of those affected, with Clint's evidence serving as a cornerstone of the case. In a tense courtroom, the judge meticulously reviewed the mountain of documentation, and one by one, the misdeeds were laid out in stark detail. The ruling was unequivocal. The HOA was to be dissolved, its assets frozen, and its leadership held accountable for the systemic abuse of power. Local news outlets seized upon the story, headlining it as a landmark victory against bureaucratic tyranny. The state attorney general even launched an independent task force to oversee the restructuring of neighborhood associations, ensuring that the horrors of the past would never be repeated. For the first time in years, the residents of the community could see a future free from the oppressive thumb of arbitrary regulation. Clint, who had long been the reluctant champion of the people, received accolades not only from his neighbors, but also from local legal advocates who praised his unwavering dedication and meticulous record-keeping. His final power move had been to expose a corrupt system, and in doing so he had sparked a wave of reform that would protect individual rights for years to come. As the legal proceedings drew to a close, the collapse of the old HOA became a symbol of justice finally served. The combination of hefty fines, criminal charges against board members, and the institution's forced dissolution signified the end of an era of exploitation. Clint's determination had not only saved his farm's legacy, but had also set a precedent for communities across the region. With the legal hammer of justice falling hard, Karen's personal world began to crumble. Once the feared and infallible face of the HOA, she now found herself the subject of public ridicule and relentless legal scrutiny. The lavish lifestyle she had so arrogantly flaunted, built on the back of unjust fines and misappropriated funds, was swiftly dismantled as her bank accounts were frozen and her assets seized. In the days following the HOA's dissolution, Karen was forced to resign in a spectacle of humiliation. News cameras captured her as she exited a courthouse in a state of disarray, her once commanding presence reduced to a figure of pity and scorn. Gossip spread quickly through the community. Her personal relationships were in tatters, her car was repossessed, and even her attempts at a comeback were met with derision. The final twist of poetic justice came when Karen, desperate for any semblance of employment, accepted a low-level position as an assistant property manager for another HOA, a body that prided itself on strict adherence to the very rules she had once enforced arbitrarily. One brisk morning, as Clint drove past the modest office building where she now worked, he caught a glimpse of her exiting the building in plain, unremarkable attire. A wry smile tugged at his lips as he murmured, "I hope you like following the rules." That remark, simple yet laden with irony, spread through the community like wildfire. Neighbors exchanged knowing looks and chuckled over how the mighty had fallen. Karen's personal downfall was no longer just a matter of legal consequence. It had become a symbol of the collapse of tyrannical power. Interviews with former board members and disgruntled residents painted a unanimous picture. Karen's era of terror was over. The community, once cowed by her overbearing presence, now relished every opportunity to reclaim their dignity and share in the triumph over injustice. For Clint, the sight of Karen's public humiliation was bittersweet, a vindication of his struggle and a poignant reminder that true power lies in fairness, integrity, and community spirit. In the months that followed the collapse of the old HOA and Karen's spectacular downfall, the community of Maple Grove began to heal. The fields once marred by conflict were now vibrant with renewed life, and Clint's farm stood as a beacon of resilience and tradition. The ghost pepper plants, once planted in quiet defiance, had become legendary, their fiery reputation a lasting testament to the power of creative resistance. At a community celebration organized by the newly formed council, neighbors gathered to mark a new beginning. Laughter, music, and the aroma of home-cooked meals filled the air as old wounds slowly healed. Among the festivities, a local artist unveiled a humorous mural depicting a red-faced Karen clutching a giant chili pepper, a final mic drop on the tyranny that had once gripped the community. Clint, sitting on his porch with a cup of steaming coffee in hand, watched as children ran through the fields and neighbors exchanged cheerful banter. A longtime friend approached him with a playful grin and handed him a mock HOA violation notice for excessive deliciousness in the community salad, an inside joke that captured the spirit of the moment. Smirking, Clint replied, "They really tried." His words, simple yet profound, resonated with everyone present, a celebration not just of a hard-fought victory, but of a community that had reclaimed its freedom and dignity. In that peaceful twilight, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, the memory of oppressive rules faded into the background. The legacy of Karen's misdeeds was transformed into a cautionary tale, a reminder that true power belongs to the people and that justice, however delayed, will always prevail. Fade to black.